This all took place a few days ago, and I'm still unsure what went on. I was sitting in my room playing some Xbox when I heard what sounded like a dying animal coming from outside my window. I had heard it a few times earlier that day, but this time it was much louder and more aggressive. This of course freaked me out, so I went outside to investigate. For context, my window leads to my backyard, which is right next to a laneway, separated only by a crappy little fence. I walk outside and head to where my window is. I found my dog absolutely losing it at the fence. He was barking and scratching. The strange noise had stopped, but I realized that a bunch of the other dogs in my street were also going crazy. Initially, I thought maybe some of the strays were fighting, and one got injured. I stuck my head over the fence to have a look, but there was nothing there. I calmed my dog down and headed inside to the front window that overlooks the street. Mind you, the window is quite hard to spot from the street, and that's what makes the next part extra creepy. The dogs in my street were all still going crazy, so I looked out the front window, expecting to see some dogs chasing each other or something like that. All that I saw was a strange-looking man walking down the road. His back was turned to me, and I stared for a bit. I was trying to analyze the situation. That's when out of nowhere, he turned full 180 and made direct eye contact with me. When his eyes met mine, I nearly crapped myself and quickly ran from the window. I gathered my thoughts for a second or two and decided to look back to see if he was still standing there. But nothing. No one. He was gone. The time between me leaving the window to me looking back to see nothing was too short for him to have left. This whole experience left me quite shaken and confused to what I actually witnessed. I stayed with my friend for a couple of weeks in the town I grew up in. She works at a restaurant. Without giving away too many details about the location, it's a plaza with a river nearby, a movie theater, restaurants, and boutiques. We entered through the parking garage, which has 3 stories, both elevators and stairs. This is important. She had a 6-hour shift, so I decided to do some shopping, listen to music, and walk around before eating at the restaurant she worked at. I was sitting at the bar on the corner alone, listening to music. This is when a bigger man approached me. He had a security guard beanie on that was incredibly dirty and tattered up. He was muttering, and his eyes were barely open. What I got from his muttering was, "Are you? I like your. Is anyone sitting?" But keep in mind it was all incredibly muttered. I'm just guessing what he was trying to say. All of this was said while he was switching back and forth between looking into my eyes and staring at my chest. I told him multiple times I couldn't understand what he was saying. After a bit of back and forth, I put the headphones back around my neck and he left me alone. I told my friend about what happened. I tried to shake it off as an isolated incident. But if this is where the story ended, I wouldn't be writing this, unfortunately. About an hour or so later, I see someone approach the bar to my left out of the corner of my eye. I felt their eyes on me. I didn't look, but somehow I knew it was him. My heart started beating really fast. I texted my friend and told her I felt really sketched out. I wanted to believe that I was just misreading things, and I was only letting my anxiety get the best of me, but I couldn't shake the feeling. About 30 minutes later, she gets off work. As we walked towards the parking garage stairs to get to our car, I saw him sitting on the bench, waiting for me. The benches aren't super close to the elevators, but they are closer to the restaurant if anything. The second I spotted him, my blood ran cold. He saw us walking towards the stairs to the parking garage and started running towards us. I was face to face with him by the time we got to the top of the stairs. We booked it back to the restaurant and used the employee elevator to get to her car, and another employee escorted us to the car as well. The employee told us that there are a lot of cases of homeless people who walk around the restaurants. So I presume he was homeless and just walking in and out of the restaurants until he saw me. I'm incredibly thankful I trusted my gut and that I saw him. I don't know what would have happened to us if I didn't see him at first, but I don't want to find out. This happened a couple of weeks ago. I was heading home from my friend's house one night. It was maybe around 11:30 p.m. My friend lives about 25 minutes away from me, and the fastest way to get home is if I take the back roads. I do live in a small rural town. I was driving home with one other car about 4 lengths in front of me. I'm about 5 minutes away from my house when I see the car's taillights suddenly break. Then, the car speeds off and turns off a road I couldn't see anymore. I didn't think too much of it. Maybe an animal ran out in front of them, and they didn't want to hit it. As I get to the part of the road where the car slammed on their brakes, a man, a big man, probably 6+ feet tall, in a black hoodie, jumps in front of my car, flailing his arms and yelling at me. I swerve to the right not to hit him, and look in my rear view, and now he's gone. This road had houses, but where this man was, there were none. There was no street light, no broken down car, nothing. I raced home and called my husband, who was about 2.5 hours away at an event, and he wouldn't be home till after midnight. I told him what happened and how he just disappeared. I was terrified to get out of my car and walk into our house. He stayed on the phone with me until I got inside, and he immediately headed home. There's been a lot of weird break-ins around my area lately, and people trying to steal cars. Luckily, I've seen too many true crime docs to where I would have stopped, but I avoided taking that way home for now, and if I do, it's all I think about. This was back in January, earlier this year. My friend and I had just started working on our film project and were getting ideas of locations to shoot the film. We drove to a swinging bridge about an hour away from our hometown. It was your usual unsturdy bridge that was about 400 feet long and 60 feet above the water. This bridge was only meant for walking, no running, no biking. It was parallel to another bridge, one that was made for vehicles. My friend and I got a couple shots of the bridge itself before we made our way to the other side. This is where the train tracks were and a neighborhood. About halfway across the bridge, we heard yelling coming from the other one. We looked, and it appeared to be a lady waving her arms like she was trying to get our attention. She called out a name, what I thought was Hayden or Aiden, which both of those names were neither close to mine or my friends. We yelled back that we weren't them, thinking that would end the conversation. The woman just stood there, staring at us. We tried to shrug it off as we thought it had been settled. But then the woman takes off at full speed, running across the bridge, in the same direction we're going. We thought it was strange, but we just laughed it off and carried on. We made it to the other side of the bridge and began shooting footage near the train tracks. I know it's unsafe, but this was a regular crossing point for the bridge trail. While we were in the middle of the scene, I heard a familiar voice yell from behind me. It was the same woman, yelling the same thing. She stood on top of the hill that was across the tracks. Again, we yelled back that we didn't know her and that we're not who she thinks we are. This woman takes off running, once again, but this time, it was towards us. This frightened us, because why would this woman need to get to us that bad? My friend and I quickly grabbed our things and headed for the swinging bridge. We knew we weren't supposed to run across, so instead, we walked super fast, and that made the bridge sway. It was like our fight or flight kicked in. The lady had caught up to the start of the bridge by the time we made it halfway across. She was still yelling, but this time in a hateful voice. This was when I turned around to look and see how far the distance between us was. The lady had stopped at the start of the bridge, and I noticed she was holding something behind her back. Even though she wasn't running after us, we still continued to bolt across the bridge. We turned back once we reached the other side to see the woman was still standing there. She was fiddling with something in her hands. My friend pulled out her phone and began recording the woman. This made her turn back immediately, and she walked the other way. We never found out why she chased us, or what she was even holding in her hand. Sometimes I think back and wonder if maybe she needed help, but why not scream for help? I just find it strange that after we told her multiple times that we weren't the people she thought we were, she still followed us. It all started in the summertime, about 4 months after we had moved to a new house in a different state. I was 9 years old at the time, and I didn't really have any friends in the area. One day, I was out in the front yard helping my dad with yard work. He would mow the front and back yards, and I would either pick dandelions out of the ground or water the plants at the front of the house. Not super helpful, I know, but I was 9, and I wasn't allowed to do anything with the lawnmower besides maybe pull the cord to start the motor. My dad had just finished up the front yard and has moved his way to the backyard, while I stayed in the front yard to finish up. I remember seeing a package on the porch of the front door, and I was going to pick it up. That was when I turned around and saw him. A man in his late 30s, with long dark hair tied in a ponytail hanging down past his shoulders. He was wearing a plain white t-shirt, black pajama pants, and no socks or shoes. He was standing at the end of our street, standing with his arms crossed and staring directly at me. Now for context. My house is 4 houses down from the end of the street. At the end of the street, there is a road that forms a T-shaped intersection. On the other side of this intersection from my house, there are 3 houses, with one lined up in the middle of my street and the other 2 sitting to the right of it. To the left of the house lined up with my street is an old steel treating factory that existed surrounded by the houses in the neighborhood. And at the time, it was still active 24/7. He was standing right off the edge of the street and in front of what I assumed was his house, just staring at me. As soon as I saw him, I immediately froze and stared back at him, with a sudden uneasy feeling washing over me. The longer I looked at him, the more red flags I began to notice. To my 9-year-old mind, this man was dressed very strangely, and that had already been an immediate red flag. But the creepiest thing that stood out to me was his face. His face had absolutely no expression of any kind. It felt like he was staring right through me, and for at least 2 minutes as we stared at each other, never looking away or even blinking. Eventually, the uneasy feeling built up enough for me to slowly walk myself down the porch and over to the side of the house, never looking away from the man. When I made it out of sight, I ran to the backyard to tell my dad about what just happened. I came up to him as he finished mowing the backyard, and I described what I had seen. That was when he told me that he had seen this man the other day doing the exact same thing, except just staring down the street, arms crossed, plain white t-shirt, pajama pants, and no shoes, just like when I had seen him. After that, my dad told me that he thought he seemed off, and to stay as far away from him as I could. Unfortunately, that would not be the last time I saw the man at the end of our street. From that point, I would see this man much more often. I would be riding in our car with my family, or outside doing something in our yard on our block, and I would look over to see him standing at the same spot, arms crossed, intensely staring. He wasn't there 24/7, but at least 3 days a week, I would see him outside, sometimes for 5 or more hours at a time. If not staring at me, staring at someone walking their dog or a car passing by. Once I tried to figure out a schedule so I wouldn't have to see him around as much. but it felt too creepy trying to keep track of him. He would occasionally start scanning his head around, looking for people to lock onto, and this really creeped me out. Now, some of you may be thinking, he's just staring and not doing anything, and that's not bad, right? Well, sadly, I would later find out that things were far worse than I had ever imagined. So now, fast forward about 9 years. I am now 18 years old and looking to get a job to save up for my first car. I hadn't really been able to save any money up to that point, and my parents weren't in any position to be able to help me with purchasing one. So I knew I'd have to try and find a job that would be easy for me to get to, and that would pay enough for me to hopefully get a cheap car quickly. Lo and behold, the steel treating factory next to the creepy man's house has a hiring sign out front. I decided that since it was a 2-minute walk away, it would be worth it, even if it meant walking past the creepy man's house. I had seen this guy doing this routine for almost a decade, and at this point, I figured it wouldn't be a problem. So I applied and ended up getting the job. It was hard work, which usually consisted of heavy physical labor and keeping up at constant pace. But nothing I hadn't expected. I started off fairly slowly, but ended up getting much better and being able to do tasks much faster. About 3 months in, I was assigned to work on a machine that had not been previously worked on. It was located at the loading dock. From the loading dock, I had a clear view of the wooden fence that separated the factory loading zone from the creepy man's house, as well as the front of his driveway where he would normally stand. I was able to notice a large hole in the fence, which seemed like it had been made in some kind of accident. The fence was not broken cleanly, but there were splinters and cracks in the fence where the hole had been made. I had asked the floor worker who was with me at the dock, let's call him Ronnie. I asked him if he knew anything about this, and this actually got us into a longer conversation about the creepy man. Ronnie had been with the steel treating factory for over 15 years, and he had seen the man during his staring routines more than once. According to Ronnie, the hole in the fence had been made by the creepy man, and he had told the managers of the plant that it had been an accident with his truck. But that's not all. Ronnie then went on to tell me that the creepy neighbor actually runs a daycare out of his house, and it was an unregistered business that led to the police being called on him more than once. This surprised me, as I had never seen the police over at his house before. But after Ronnie told me this, something else occurred to me. When looking at the creepy man's house, whenever his van wasn't sitting in the driveway, you could see one of those children's mini playgrounds with the slide and toys built in, the kind toddlers would play with. This always struck me as odd, as I'd never once in those 9 years up to that point had seen anyone else come or go from his house, especially not any children. But I'd never really dedicated much thought to it. After Ronnie told me this, I thought back to when I'd first seen him as a 9-year-old, and all of the other times he had been staring at me, growing up. I began to wonder if he was secretly plotting to try and get me over to his unofficial daycare. Sadly, I couldn't really confirm what Ronnie had told me, so I just filed the story into the back of my head as something I would not be surprised to find out was true. I left that job not long after this. I'd saved up the money I needed for a car and was able to make my way into the career field I was hoping to make it into. Now fast forward 3 years, as this is the scariest thing that's ever happened to me, and the reason why I'm posting this. I had moved away from home, but ended up having to move back home with my parents for reasons I'm not getting into. I had also met my girlfriend, and we would go back to my parents' house to watch old movies or play games in my basement setup. My girlfriend was aware of the creepy man, but paid him as much mind as anyone else did. As creepy as he wasn't breaking the law by standing there, and our lives already had too much going on for us to be focusing our time and attention on his weirdness. On this night, I was driving home with my girlfriend for a normal night of watching movies. I didn't want to block my mother's car in to our single-lane driveway, so I had recently started parking in the grass patch behind our house. Behind our house was an alley that ran past everyone's backyards. Our backyard had a wooden fence up against the alley, with a separate garage building which opened up into the alley. I had started to park in the patch of grass in the area between the garage doors and the alley more often, and so that was the direction I'd been driving home, silently hoping to myself that the creepy man wouldn't be outside on a pleasant night like this. Well, of course, I jinxed it. And the way that I was going ended up taking us right past him, standing and staring us down. I locked eyes with him briefly, and we drove past him, headed to the right side of the T intersection to turn to the alley to go behind my house. But here's where things got scary. For some reason, I didn't know why, as we passed by the creepy man, I got a really bad feeling. A feeling very similar to the day I had first seen him. A gut-wrenching, something is wrong kind of feeling. And so, I decided to take a look out of my driver's side mirror. To my horror, the creepy man had actually left his post and started walking quickly in my direction. I can honestly say that this was my first time I'd ever seen the creepy man not standing still. And here he was walking in the same direction I'd gone. As my thoughts started to race, I turned into the alleyway and then went 4 houses down, turning into the patch of grass behind the garage in our backyard. I immediately told my girlfriend what I'd seen and how strange it was. From the angle that my car was parked, I could turn around in my driver's seat and stare down the alleyway through the slits of the wooden fence in our backyard. I would be able to see if he was coming and if he rounded the corner. I locked my car doors, turned in my seat, and reached into my pocket to tightly grip my pocket knife. My eyes widened, and my heart started beating fast as I saw him casually walking down the alleyway through the slits. He was right up to the edge of the wooden fence, and then paused. After a few moments, he turned around 180 degrees and started walking back down the alleyway in the direction he had come from. I waited about 2 minutes before getting out of my car and slowly approaching the edge of the fence, then walking into the alley to see where he had gone. I don't know if he recognized me or the house that I'd pulled into, or why he chose that night to follow me and my girlfriend and scare the hell out of us. Honestly now, I don't really care. I was able to move out of that house shortly after that happened, and I am now living with my girlfriend, who today is my fiancé. But to the man that stared at me and my entire neighborhood for over half my life, and who followed me and my girlfriend into a dark alley for who knows what reason, let's never meet again. When I was 16, I went on a blind date with a friend of a friend to a dance. He went to a different school, but we talked on the phone a couple of times leading to the dance. This was in the days before cell phones. We got along pretty well, and we had fun at the dance. We continued to talk on the phone a little while after that, but it was clear that he was really hung up on his ex-girlfriend, so I naturally was losing interest. I stopped taking his calls close to Christmas. That was when he told me his ideal Christmas gift would be his ex-girlfriend and her new boyfriend dead under his Christmas tree. He said that very seriously, and it scared me. Apparently, no longer taking his calls was a huge mistake. He started sending messages through our mutual friend, which after this is not my friend. And they were increasingly insulting and upsetting. But the worst was that he knew which store in the mall I worked at, and he would come by with his friends while I was stationed at the registers and couldn't go anywhere. They would just stand outside the doors to the store and yell all kinds of things at me. I don't know how my coworkers and managers never thought there was an issue with this, but they did nothing. This went on for weeks. The final message he sent through our mutual friend was that he was going to assault me. He didn't use the word assault. The friend clearly thought this was funny. I was at my locker at the end of the school day when this message was delivered. I slammed the door right next to his face and snarled an FU. I'm pretty sure that was the first time I'd ever said that and truly meant it. He looked surprised and backed away. I don't know exactly what he said to the stalker, but somehow the harassment stopped after that. All the same, I was seriously on edge for a while going to and from work, or any time I was alone away from home. In the case, he decided to follow up on his last message. I felt hunted. Fortunately, nothing ever came of it, but I still feel stupid for not telling my parents or the school what was going on. It's almost been 30 years, but that guy can still go F himself. I met this girl on Tinder, and we agreed to go out. We went out, she was very nice, and we got along well. At the end of the day, she mentions to me that she was in the psychiatric hospital for a whole year, and how I wouldn't have liked her back then. I didn't think much of it, as I get people go through tough times. Then by the time I got home, she messaged me a question. Why aren't you registered to vote? So, to look up if someone is registered to vote in the country I live in, you need the following: first, middle, and last name, date of birth, and address. Somehow she had all of it. I was confused as I wasn't carrying any sort of identification on the day we went out. So I asked her, how did you find that out? She said, don't worry, I've got my sources, just making sure you don't stuff me around. I became distant, which was the wrong thing to do, as I would be getting around 50 messages a day. The messages would be stuff like, why are you ignoring me? You're very rude. I hope you have a horrible day. Then it would switch to, I'm sorry for being a lot to handle. You need to put effort in for this to work. I see us having a future. At this time, I was attending university, and she didn't. She texted me one day saying, what time is your lunch break? I'm here and I got you food. I ignored the message and went to lunch with my female classmate. I then got a long message about how I'm a cheating piece of crap, and I deserve to die. She then called the female classmate a bunch of choice words, and she hopes that she makes me happy. Then she started posting about me cheating on her social media. I blocked her off of everything and deactivated my social media for a while till it blew over. I haven't heard from her since. It was my ex. When we broke up, it was all very dramatic. He got on a bus across the country the same day for whatever reason. He also sent a long message from the bus, ending with, "This is not a goodbye." I said, "Yes it is," and wished him good luck. 2 years later, I've met my now husband, and I suppose he moved back 3 years later. I started seeing him everywhere. He followed the two of us around Walmart for 45 minutes. That was when I posted up near a security guard and slipped out as he tried to wait for me to get away from the security guard. Then I saw him again, wandering around near my mother's house. I had at this point moved in with my husband. Then I saw him outside of my work. He was clearly trying to get the courage to come in, and he was also very clearly high. Some of the regular police officers came in by chance for their coffee, and he left when they arrived. He later figured out the general location where I was living, and I saw him sort of wandering around a few times. I didn't go home when I saw him. I went and sat in a public place for a few hours. Then I changed places of work, and I saw him outside about 3 times. I was near a major transportation hub, so I tried to ignore it. But when he started doing the pacing, tweaking, and chain-smoking thing again, I figured I should do something about it. I waited for a family friend who I knew was pretty domineering, and I knew would go to bat for me and let him know who it was and what he was doing. He went outside and told my ex off, I suppose, and scared him, I guess, because he left pretty quickly. My family friend was a bus driver, so I gave him a picture, and he shared it with some other drivers along my regular route. As long as I stuck to that route, the few more times I saw him trying to get on my bus, we would drive right past him, or the wrong door open to let people off, and not let him on. We finally moved again, and I quit my job because I'd been bouncing around the same chain and it was easy to find. Since then, I had seen him once, but he didn't see me, and I also think it was unrelated because he actually bought something. I just sat in the camera room and watched till he left. It's been an additional 5 years now, so I assumed he figured himself out. I got an air of doom every time I saw him. He was kind when we dated, never abusive, but he was anti-drugs and anti-smoking, so to see him high and things like that set off alarm bells. I know he was not well when he returned. I don't know what would have happened had he had gotten close to me. Maybe nothing, but every bone in my body was screaming danger. So I trusted my gut and took steps to maintain distance, and I was okay. The police wouldn't have done anything. No threats were uttered, and we were always in public. But all in all, it turned out okay. We were camping for 4 days in an area of the Red Feather Lakes in northern Colorado. Deep in the woods, we were 20 miles down a dirt road without anyone else in sight. We arrived during the day and didn't notice anything unusual. We had enough supplies for about 6 days for our party. This included my wife and I, my brother-in-law, my 3 nephews, aged 5, 6, and 8, and our dogs. Day 1 was amazing. We spent the day hiking, fishing, stargazing, and making s'mores. The dogs loved roaming around. The next day was equally wonderful, filled with activities like yard games such as cornhole and other board games with the boys. However, around 6 p.m., the mood changed. The dogs suddenly seemed very on edge, patrolling the edge of our camp with their hackles raised, occasionally growling at the woods. We didn't think much of it at first. We hiked miles into the forest, and everything around us was just more forest for miles in every direction. There was a hill we could climb about 700 feet or higher that allowed us to get above the tree line for stargazing. From there, we could see in every direction, with no other lights or campfires in sight. We figured the dogs were just detecting wildlife, and maybe a curious black bear, or even a mountain lion. They are big dogs, and we were armed. We didn't let the kids wander too far from our sight, but again, it didn't seem like an issue. That night, us adults stayed up around the campfire until about 1 a.m. I kept getting the feeling that something was watching us. I was more on edge than usual, despite being an avid camper with plenty of experiences and run-ins with bears and other wildlife. It just felt different. When we finally went to bed, I don't think I slept more than half an hour at a time. I swear, I kept hearing the occasional crack of branches off in the woods. The next day, we didn't notice anything odd about the camp. Although my brother suspected something had happened to our water. We had 5 or 6 of those 5-gallon jugs with the pull-out spigots. 2 were in my truck, 1 in our tent, 1 in his car, and the remaining 2 appeared drained. Although it might have been the boys or a leak. We decided we might pack it in after lunch on day 3. We didn't want to end our trip early, but things just felt strange. The boys were sad, and we were back and forth on whether or not we were being paranoid. But the dogs seemed so on guard and went crazy sniffing around during our hike that day. After lunch, we started packing up our gear, packing up 2 tents, games, food, and other things. It took a while, especially with 3 little boys running around, so we weren't in a rush. By the time we were all loaded up, we decided to heat up a quick dinner. The boys had one last request. They wanted to go snipe hunting. We still had about an hour of daylight left, so we agreed. We went off into the forest and did the classic snipe hunt routine. My brother-in-law led us in a wide circle that would end back at camp. My wife stayed in the middle with the boys, and I trailed off to the rear. I'd pick up small rocks and sticks. When the boys were looking away, I'd toss them to make them jump. The other adult would go, "Oh my gosh,
I think the snipe went this way. It was good fun." As the sun was setting, not yet dark, but getting close, we were nearing camp. A rock the size of 2 fists came flying in, barely missing one of my nephews. The adults looked back at me like I was crazy, and I told them it wasn't me. Another rock came in and hit me square in the back. We didn't even ask questions. I just said time to go. Each adult grabbed a kid, and we booked it back to our cars. As we reached the cars, the woods behind us were moving. Bushes shook, and the tree branches cracked and popped. We loaded up quickly, not caring if we left anything behind. We had about 20 miles of dirt road back to concrete. About a quarter mile into our drive, the road became littered with bones and animal carcasses, beheaded deer and raccoon bodies, some fresh, others just bones. We drove left and right, trying to avoid hitting any of them. It felt like nearly a mile of this. Finally, we made it through, and it was clear driving for a couple of miles. We reached a clearing and saw a green bus pulled off for another campsite. For some reason, I decided to stop and see if there was anyone there to warn them of what just happened. My brother kept driving down the road with my nephews. My wife stayed in the car, and I approached the green bus. As I got close, I saw it was super run down, flat tires, newspapers over the windows, peeling paint. There was a big fire pit, about 20 by 20 feet, and pretty deep. It was filled with an immense pile of bones. I saw moose antlers, femurs of all sizes, rib cages, around 40 animals worth of bones. Glancing around, I noticed little symbols on the bus, and tied up in the trees with string were a bunch of dead animals. I booked it back to the truck and said nope to my wife. We hauled it out of there down the road to catch up with my brother. The whole stop lasted maybe a minute. I was camping with a friend in an area of British Columbia known for its grizzly bears, black bears, and cougars. One evening, while sitting at the campfire after sunset, as it was just starting to get dark, we heard a sort of grunting and growling noise coming from the bushes not too far from our site. We ignored the first 1 or 2 sounds, but after the noise kept occurring every couple of minutes, it had our attention. We decided to look around to see if we could identify what was making the noise and hopefully scare it off. The noise continued every few minutes and eventually became louder. We assumed the source was getting closer to us, and the adrenaline was pumping. It's worth mentioning that all we had on us was a knife each, as we forgot to bring any bear spray and didn't have any guns with us on the trip. Next thing we knew, we heard a sound from behind us, which I can only describe as an entire tree being ripped out of the ground, split in two, and thrown to the ground again. It was a huge crashing noise, followed by dead silence. We sprinted back to the car and climbed inside, peering out into the darkness, trying to spot any signs of movement. But we couldn't see or hear anything. We never caught a glimpse of whatever made the noise, and the next morning, we searched extensively but couldn't find any signs of recently broken branches or fallen trees. We did find one cougar track a few hundred meters away on a sandy creek bed, but I'm not sure if that was related since the creek was in a different area than where the noise had come from. I still have no idea if it was a bear, a cougar, a Sasquatch, or something else. Needless to say, I didn't sleep at all that night. An ex-girlfriend and I were late getting to Tate's Hell State Forest in Carabel, Florida, back in May 2021. It was around 11 p.m., dark out, and we had been driving down an unimproved road for about 30 minutes. We then followed the GPS down a very narrow trail, I was driving a mid-sized truck, and the branches on either side of the truck were constantly scraping against it. We were driving slowly due to the ruts and puddles. That was when we saw something emerge from the left-hand side of the trail. It crossed the trail, stopped, looked at us in the truck, and then disappeared into the woods to the right-hand side. This all happened in a total of maybe 4 to 5 seconds, and it was on 2 legs. It seemed so out of place because of the location. We were 40 minutes outside of civilization and finished roads. The conditions, the time, and the speed and effortlessness which it moved. I can't even describe the marsh-like conditions we were driving through, all for this bipedal thing to traverse it with such ease. Its arms swung as it walked, its eyes reflected the headlights, and its body stood powerfully tall. The details of its skin or fur are a bit harder to describe due to the sprinkling rain as well as the 15-foot distance away. The most significant part of the story is that we were on the wrong trail. We got stuck just a few yards from where we saw this thing. As I fearfully got out to dig my tires out, nothing happened to us. I was exposed, out of my element, wet, knee-deep in mud, and alone outside the truck, as I didn't want my ex to get out. I struggled for 30 minutes and could have easily been harmed or approached. However, nothing happened. A tow truck rescued us at 2 a.m., and we gladly booked a hotel room for the night, as we were extremely freaked out. I traveled to Seoul for a week by myself back in 2018. I was studying at that time, and I was doing a semester abroad in Kyoto. Seoul is expensive, so I decided to book a room in a hostel. It was supposed to be a mixed dorm for 6 people. Upon arrival, I found out that I was actually going to be sharing a room with 5 other men who were already staying at the hostel. At that point, I was still quite naive and didn't think much of it. Besides, the hostel was already fully booked. There was 1 guy from Japan, 1 from Korea, 2 from China, and 1 from Germany in my room. The German guy gave me weird vibes from the beginning, especially by the way he just stared at me, but I brushed it off because I was going to be out all day anyways. Every day, he'd ask if I wanted to hang out and go see the sights together, which I would have rather done on my own, so I just came up with an excuse. One time, I accepted his invitation to explore Gangnam, and it was just awkward. We had very little to speak about besides small talk. In the mornings, when I would do my makeup and my hair, he would just stand there and watch, saying nothing. I got annoyed and asked him if there was somewhere else he had to be numerous times. He'd just shrug after. Anyway, for the entire week, I was weirded out but did my best to avoid him. One time, we ran into each other at a cafe in the city center, which I found strange because what are the odds? The other guys in my dorm were all super nice. We even all went out for dinner one night. Then, on my very last day, I woke up too early and drifted back to sleep. The next time I woke up, it was to him sitting by my bedside and caressing my arm and shoulder. I immediately sat straight up and asked him what he was doing. Even though it was only my arm he was touching, I still felt so disgusted. I always thought of myself as someone who would scream and curse at a situation like this, but I was simply dazed and shocked. He then went on to confess his love for me. He then said he wanted to meet up when we were back at home, as I'm from Germany too, and how I was just so special. When I pointed out he couldn't possibly be in love with me because it had only been a week, he insisted that he just knew and that he wanted to show me his affection. At that point, I was so nauseous. Of course he was leaving that morning too, and offered to go to the airport together. I insisted on taking a later bus, and he thankfully left it at that.
I couldn't wait for him to just go and leave me alone. I'm glad I didn't run into him at the airport, but at some point, I just burst into tears. I'd been so exhausted trying to ward off his advances all week, and then gently tell him that I wasn't interested after he touched me while I was sleeping. I don't even know how I managed to remain so calm and polite to him, but who knows how he would have acted if I'd been aggressive. In hindsight, I think I should have just insisted on switching rooms, but up until that very last morning, nothing actually happened, and I would tell myself that maybe that poor guy was just awkward and didn't mean it. I go to the gym rather late. I'm a parent and a college student, so late-night gym sessions work better for me. I once got out of the gym around 12 a.m. I stopped at the gas station to put some air in my tires, and I noticed a man kind of eyeing me from afar. He then came up to me, offering to finish it for me. I politely declined. He then went on, saying I have a good figure, and I was really pretty. I thanked him, and then tried to go on about my business. He keeps talking, mentions how I remind him of his girlfriend who died a couple of years ago, and how he's trying to get it all together. There was a red car parked next to me, and it was full of stuff in the back. It was like someone lived in it. He said it was his, and he was renting a little room for his business, but once the landlord found out that he was living in it and not doing business, he got kicked out. He said it was full of books, and that he loved to read. He said he doesn't have anywhere else to go, and he can't go anywhere because he doesn't have plates on his car. He asked if I would follow him back to the office so the police would avoid reading his plates, since around this time there was a bunch of them. I already knew this was a red flag, but I was raised as a people pleaser and couldn't say no. After I said yes, I knew I made a mistake. I tried to turn back, but he said it's fine. It's just down the street, and it'll be quick. I followed him and get to the office. It's in a dark alley, and no one was around. There were no streetlights either. He tried to keep talking to me when he got out of his car, and I kept my windows rolled up with a small crack, just enough for me and him to hear each other, but not so much that he could reach inside. I kept my doors locked. He opened the door to his office and tried to convince me that there wasn't anyone else there and that it's safe. But all I saw from my car was one exit to a small room, and he was standing right in front of it. I did see books, but it was not enough to convince me. He said he would bring them outside, but they were too heavy. I of course declined and said no, I'm not going in there. He kept trying to talk me into it, saying he's not going to do anything to me, and that he just wants to show me his books and his office. I declined again and again, and I said I would be leaving. He stopped, and he was quiet for a bit. Then he just said, "You're smart." After that, I sped off and never saw him again. This was several years ago. I've never really spoken about it, and I figured it belonged here. I was about 18 or 19, and definitely looked younger. I was working as a barista at the time, at a place near the hotspot for the homeless population. Don't get me wrong, I loved them all dearly, but it made for some interesting interactions at times. One shift, I take the order of a very interesting-looking man. I dress goth, and personally, I'm not one to judge style. But he had quite a lot of scarification done to him, and all over his hands. Honestly, I probably would have thought it was cool on anyone else, but he in particular gave me the creeps. He ordered the cheapest thing he could, and when I asked him for his name, he says, let's go with John. I ignored his banter, put down his supposed name, and he drops me a $5 tip and sits down. I knew he was watching me, but I didn't look over at him. When his order was ready, I called out John. He comes to grab it and proceeds to show me some rainbow chrome skull thing he had. Very cool, John. He continued to stay for 2 hours, ordering an occasional coffee and tipping me. I'm not sure when or where he managed to get it, but he ended up bringing me a flower in a plastic dinosaur-shaped vase. It was kind of cute, but I was terrified. At that point, I let my manager know, and he kicked the guy out. Now, the very same night, I make it back home from my shift and go about my day. Then I heard a loud popping outside in my neighborhood, and that freaked me out a little. A while later, something told me to check the news on my phone. I figured if something did happen, I would find it. Nope, just a photo of John, and an article announcing his long-awaited arrest for kidnapping and arson. There was very little information about the kidnapping, but as for the arson, he set a retirement home on fire. The photo was undeniably him, but anyway, I am glad I made it out. I was out with my dog, following the same route at the same time as usual. At one point, we passed through the darkest part of the path, where there's an alley to the left with no lights. Suddenly, my dog started barking like crazy, clearly alarmed. I had my headphones on, but knew something was off. When I looked towards the alley, I didn't see anything at first, but then, as my eyes adjusted, I noticed a very tall and skinny man standing there. He didn't move. He just stood facing me and staring. Or at least it seemed that way. He was dressed in all black, which was strange since it was 90 to 100 degrees all week, and it was 10:30 at night. I kind of just froze for a moment, and then said, pretty loudly as I turned my headphones off to listen. The man still said nothing, and as I started to turn toward him, I continued walking forward. After a moment of silence, with me trying to walk away and chalk it up as a creepy but harmless encounter, he started to follow me. He followed me for about 2 to 3 minutes, not saying a word, just staring. When I finally felt like I could speak, I shouted, telling him that my dog's gonna bite him. That seemed to scare him a bit, but he continued following me for another 30 seconds or so, before slowly turning off the sidewalk and walked in a completely different direction. When he turned, I noticed he had a huge backpack, and it looked extremely full. I have a really uneasy feeling about this. I walk this path almost every night, and it seems odd that this man was just standing there in the darkest alley. Almost a year ago, at the end of August 2019, I moved to an apartment in a different city. I made this move because of my mother, who I lived with in my hometown, passed away from cancer. I moved here with my long-term boyfriend and another roommate, who has been a good friend of ours since before we started dating. We all love it here. The location is great. It's a 15-minute bike ride from my university, and we're situated in a square with a grocery store, drugstore, lunchrooms, and more. We have everything we need within a walking distance. However, after just a month or two of living here, someone started ringing our doorbell exactly at 11:05, semi-regularly. Sometimes it happens every day, other times every other day, and occasionally there's a week or two between incidents, but it's always at 11:05 p.m. Each time, I ask through the intercom who it is, but I get no response. Except for one time, but I'll explain that later. At first, I thought it might be friends of our neighbors accidentally ringing the wrong doorbell. But after about the 4th time, I grew suspicious.
especially since it was always at the same time. My boyfriend and roommate both work at bars and usually get home around 2 a.m., so I was alone each time it happened. It really started to freak me out. When I first told them about it, they shrugged it off as a wrong dial, like I initially thought. But when I explained that it happened so frequently and sometimes daily, they didn't really believe me and thought I was just paranoid. Then one night, the doorbell rang again. When I answered the intercom and asked who it was, I heard a very heavy breathing. I was quite freaked out, as once again I was home alone. I kept asking who they were and what they wanted. I couldn't tell from the breathing if it was a man or a woman, but I heard strange mumbling or whispering before it went dead silent. They seemed to have left. I double-locked my apartment door after that. I felt quite scared and spooked. Thankfully, my roommate got home a little earlier that night, about 30 minutes after the doorbell rang, and he could see how upset I was. Now, with the corona crisis, my roommate and boyfriend couldn't work anymore, so they started witnessing the doorbell ringing. They now believed me and agreed that it was very odd and creepy. We have a balcony that overlooks the front door of our apartment building, but a shop below us has awnings that partially obscures the view. Every time the doorbell rang, we would go to the balcony to see if we could spot anyone, but we never could. I also asked my neighbors if they experienced the frequent doorbell ringing, but those I spoke to had never had it happen to them. 2 weeks ago, my roommate decided to investigate. He went outside our apartment building at 11 p.m., stood across the street, and pretended to smoke while keeping an eye on the door. He saw a man who looked suspicious wandering around the building. The man slowed down significantly when he approached our door, but when he saw my roommate look at him, he quickly walked away. We're not 100% sure if that's the guy, but we are very suspicious. Since that day, our doorbell hasn't rung at night. I hope it stops for good. However, there's still a possibility that it might start again in a few weeks. Maybe not so creepy to the general public, but it definitely made me nervous at the time. When I was about 12 years old, in 2007, I was home alone babysitting my 2 younger sisters while my parents were away at an event. It was summertime, so it stayed light out for a while in the evening. Just as it was starting to get dark, I went to the kitchen to make a bowl of popcorn. When I looked out the kitchen window, I saw that there was a car parked, hiding in the tree line of our front yard. For context, we live in a fairly rural place, and we rarely had people out our direction, unless they lived down our gravel road. But in that case, we knew the neighbors' cars. This was a junky beater, and the license plates had been taped over, so it was not one of our neighbors. I was a kid who was pretty aware of my surroundings, and I decided to step back from the big kitchen window and go into the dark entryway hall to get a better look. There was just a single man, sitting and staring in the car directly at the house with the lights off. Immediately, I locked the front and back door. I calmly told my brother and sister to play in their room and not to come out until I got them for the movie night. I then went back to the kitchen to get the phone to call my mom, but she didn't answer. I watched him through the curtains sit in the dark tree line and stare at the house for what felt like ages. Finally, someone drove down our road, and their headlights reflected off the car. He started the engine, drove out of the trees, and booked it down the gravel. I was still very nervous and tried calling my mom again. No answer. So for the rest of the time, I just played with my siblings in their room with the door shut and the curtains pulled until my parents came home later that night. When I tried telling my parents what happened, they were convinced I was making it all up and I was just being a dramatic kid. I swore up and down that I saw this car with blacked out plates in the tree line, and they weren't interested at all. I know what I saw, but I'm the only one who did. Maybe it was just some random guy who didn't know there were 3 young kids home alone, hiding for some reason. But I'm still glad I locked all the doors. This happened to me a couple of years ago. I have also lived on my own for a long time, so I do not get scared easily. I had just finished reading in bed, and I turned my lamp off, settled down to go to sleep, and hugged my cat close to me. This would have been about 1:30 in the morning. I closed my eyes, and I heard a voice say, meow, like imitating a cat. My window was open, so I thought it was just someone being weird outside. I opened my eyes, and in the middle of my bedroom was a small boy wearing a red jumper, waving his arms above his head. I leapt up like a ninja and put the light on. Now, my heart was going mad. Nothing paranormal has ever happened in this house, even in the entire time I've lived there. I spent the whole night totally freaked out, only getting a bit of sleep when it started to get light outside. My friends thought this was hilarious when I told them. I was saying there is no way I'm living in a haunted house, and started Googling cleansings, exorcists, and whatnot. The next few nights, other weird stuff started happening. I started sleeping with the TV on, and as soon as I tried to get any sleep, I would hear freaky voices coming from it. Or I would notice shadows dip by the sides of my bed. It was dreadful. I actually resorted to saying out loud, asking for them to stop haunting me, and I would be grateful for one night. I had never really believed in any of this sort of stuff before, so it was like seeing an entire paradigm shift for me. Anyway, I was going on about this to my friends at work, and one of them asked me if I was on drugs. Well, funny enough, I had just started taking this new tablet, Montelukast, for my asthma. When I got home, I read the side effects, a rare one being hallucinations. I stopped taking them and, well, no more hauntings. This took place in 2013, when I was around 12 years old. My mom had moved me and my siblings in with my grandparents, because we couldn't afford the rent at the time. It wasn't a big deal, though. They had plenty of room, and I got to spend a lot of time making jewelry with my grandma, which, in my little eyes, was such a win that I didn't even realize we were struggling financially. Making jewelry became our pastime after school, and one of my favorite parts was the trips we'd take to Michael's to go get beads and other materials. For those unfamiliar, Michael's is a craft store similar to Hobby Lobby, and walking around inside is a little girl's dream come true if you love DIY projects. One day, in late fall, we ran out of wire for a bracelet I was making for my mom, so we headed to our local Michael's to get more. Since it was winter, it was already dark by 5 p.m. My grandma, who had vision problems and a bad hip, entrusted little me to run inside, grab the wire, and pay for it, just as we had done many times before. I was also stubbornly independent, so she wasn't too worried. She parked in the handicapped spot right in front of the store. The sun had already set, and the big storefront windows illuminated her car behind me as I walked inside. As I stood by the display at the front, entranced by some Christmas decor, a man walked in through the sliding doors. I noticed him immediately. He was tall, or at least to me he was, likely in his mid-30s. He also had dark hair, and was dressed entirely in black. His clothes were a bit dirty, and I distinctly remember a big red D1 logo on his hoodie. He had his hands shoved into his pockets and walked briskly into the store, almost frantically. Our eyes met for a bit too long, and he continued deeper into the store. I was immediately weirded out, but I shrugged it off and went to find the wire. I found the spool of wire, but I got distracted in the toy section, and that's where I messed up. That was when I noticed him starting to follow me around, aisle after aisle. I'd be browsing, and he'd just appear at the other end, pretending to look at stuff. He was muttering to himself constantly, speaking out loud as if he was expecting a response, but never directly looking at me. As a kid, I didn't fully grasp what was happening, so I awkwardly walked away from him each time, pretending not to notice. My little brain reasoned that he wasn't following me, so I walked across the store to the wedding aisle to check out some things I'd seen when I first walked in. I figured there was no way he'd follow me there, but sure enough, while I was looking at the invitation cards, I got a spine-chilling feeling. I turned around, and there he was, right behind me. His back was to me, doing something. It looked like he was messing with something in his pants, doing something really vile to himself. I had never seen anything like that before, and the sunken-in eyes when he looked at me still haunt me to this day. It took me a minute to process what I had just seen, but once I did, I bolted it out of the store as fast as I could. I jumped into my grandma's car. I startled her with my sudden appearance. She asked what I'd gotten. Then I tried to explain what had just happened, and I saw him appear in the sliding door in front of us. The dread I felt in the moment was indescribable. He approached our car, obviously recognizing that I was with my grandma. He knocked on her window. I hadn't been able to explain myself in time before she cracked the window and asked him if everything was okay. The man gestured towards me, and with the same crazed stare, said something along the lines of, "She's a thief. She stole something from the store." I was mortified. He was trying to make her suspicious of me on top of everything else he had just put me through. Thankfully, my grandma had gotten the same bad vibes that I did, because she politely told him to back away and rolled up the window, locking the door. He suddenly started yanking at the door handle, then swung both of his arms up and started banging hard on the car's roof. It caused both of us to jump, and I started crying. My grandma slammed the car into reverse and peeled out of there. I've never seen her drive so fast. I don't remember much after that, just crying and holding a $17 spool of wire I hadn't paid for. We called the police as soon as we got home, and luckily they took it very seriously, immediately requesting the videotapes from the Michaels. A few weeks later, my grandma told me that they had found him. They mostly kept me out of the investigation, probably to avoid traumatizing the 12-year-old me further. She got the dent in her car fixed, and that was that. It wasn't until a few years later that my mom finally told me what happened to him. It turns out he already had 1 battery charge and 2 sexual assaults on his record, one involving a relative who was a minor. He had just gotten off work from the gas station across the street when he must have seen me walk into the Michaels alone. I don't know what would have happened if my grandma hadn't locked her door, or if she had been in the store with me, vulnerable to that man as well. When I was 17, I had just gotten my first car. One day, I drove my brother and myself to the dentist. While we were waiting in the lobby, I noticed someone had parked really badly next to my car. Since it was new, and I was pretty paranoid about getting it scratched or something. While my brother went in for his appointment, I decided to go move my car to a safer spot. After I parked in a new spot, I walked back to the office. Just before I could cross the parking lot to get inside, a minivan with super dark tinted windows had pulled up so close to me that it almost hit me. I thought it was strange, but I just walked around it. As I was heading to the door, I caught my reflection in the glass and noticed a guy getting out of the van and started to follow me. At first, I didn't think much of it and just started walking faster, but then he started running. That was when I realized, okay, this is actually happening. I started running too. I barely made it to the door before he could grab me. The door was glass, and I could see his reflection. He was reaching out, and inches away from me. He looked like a totally regular guy, wearing a button-up shirt and khakis, which made the whole thing even more surreal. I ran inside, and he didn't follow, probably because he didn't want to be seen. I was completely shocked, and kind of in denial about what just happened. It all went down so fast. I looked out the window and saw him holding a purple cloth in his hand. I have no idea what that was about. He looked around, then got back in his minivan and sped off. I told the receptionist, but I was still pretty shaken up and confused. The whole thing happened in less than a minute. I'm a model, and was doing work for a catalog out of state. During our break, I stated that I was going to walk back to the hotel to get my charger, as it was only a block away. One of the video crew offered to walk with me, as he also had something he wanted to grab from the hotel. We got to the hotel with no problems, but I did leave alone. As soon as I walked out the door, a man approached me and said, "I saw you walking earlier." We had been in the hotel for about 20 minutes, which means he followed us to the hotel and had been waiting for me. He continued to walk with me and ask me all kinds of personal questions. I tried to politely get out of the conversation by telling him that I have to go to work and I couldn't talk right now. He continued to follow me and ask me questions the whole way back to where I was shooting. When I got there, he asked me to come swimming in the river with him. I told him that I couldn't because I have to work. I was too afraid to be stern or tell him to F off because I've heard of so many stories of men like this becoming violent in this situation. I tried to open the door to the building because he followed me and was standing right behind me. That was when I started feeling really nervous. The door was locked. I started running around to every door, trying desperately to get inside, and he followed me to every door. They were all locked, and now I'm really in a panic. A car with 2 girls inside pulled over and called me to come to their car. I ran over, and he immediately booked it down the street and disappeared. The girls told me that they saw what happened and asked if I needed a ride. I explained I just needed to call someone to get inside, and that it seemed that he was gone now. I got on the phone with the other model, and she was on her way to open the door. I told the girls I was okay now. He was gone and someone was on their way. As soon as the girls drove away, the man appeared from around the corner on the street he left down. He had been watching and waiting for them to leave. He was walking very fast towards me. I ran up the stairs and started banging on the door, desperate to get in. He started coming up the stairs after me, and when the door finally opened, I closed it fast behind me. Needless to say, I was shaken. I never really feel safe when I walk anywhere now, no matter how short the distance is. Even walking across a parking lot is a stressful experience.
I'm a 29-year-old woman. I lived in a big city all of my life. But at the beginning of April, I moved to a medium-sized town about 1 hour away from that big city, along with my sister and our 4 pets. This happened after a month of living here. My sister was preparing for her final presentation for her arts undergraduate, which was going to be shown in the city. So she had spent the whole day there to make her preparations. I was left home alone with our cats and dogs, so in the early evening, I decided to go for a long walk with my 2 dogs. We walked for like an hour, but about 5 minutes away from our home, as we were headed back, I saw a man knocking on a door about a block away. I thought he looked a bit weird, because he would knock on the door, look around, then knock on the door, and then just look around again. He didn't look dangerous, so I just kept walking since I had to pass by him to take the street that would get me home. When I was about 10 meters away, he looked my way and started walking towards me. He was tall and slender, and was carrying what looked like a box of candy. He asked me if I had any coins to spare. I told him sorry. I only have my dog's poop bags and to have a good one. I was ready to keep walking when he saw one of my tattoos and stopped me. For some context, I have tattoos. I'm not heavily tattooed, but I have several in my arms and legs. And since I was wearing shorts, the ones on my legs were visible. The specific one he was looking at is of a ghost woman in a traditional Japanese style. As he stopped me, he said, "That's a really cool tattoo. Would you give it to me?" I just laughed uncomfortably, thinking he was joking, but he was dead serious, just staring and blinking at my tattoo. He then continued talking. "No? So you're just gonna let the maggots eat it? Such a shame. It would be better if a person ate it." At this point, he raised his face and looked me straight in the eyes, with a very flat smile that seemed to be an attempt to be friendly, but only made me feel even more uncomfortable. He then asked me for my name, and not wanting to antagonize him, I gave him a fake one. Let's say it was Regina. He then asked me if I lived in town, to which I also lied and said I was from the big city and just visiting. He then told me he used to live in that city too. He lived on the streets downtown. He told me he used to rap in buses to get money, and just out of the blue started rapping about me, still looking me straight in the eye. He rapped about how I was very pretty, how amazing my tattoos are, and in his rap, he said my name is Lorena. I corrected him and said that my name was Regina, not Lorena. Since I had suspicion that he realized I gave him a fake name and was testing me. He just smiled and nodded. He then asked me if I'd give him his number. I said that me and my dogs had to go home, and that we were expected. He pointed at a butcher shop a block away, and told me that we could sit over there while I gave him my number, and that it wouldn't take long. But I told him I couldn't, as the one that was waiting for me at home was my boyfriend. But I was lying again, since I was home alone. His smile faded a bit, but he just said, "Well, that sucks." I wished him a good evening and turned around to leave, only for him to drop to his knees and grab my leg with both hands. He started caressing my tattoo while whispering, "It really is a cool tattoo." My dogs are friendly and were pretty calm this whole exchange, but when he grabbed my leg, they started growling. I pulled my leg out of his hands, wished him a good evening again, and just walked away as fast as I could. I took a longer way home to make sure he didn't follow me, and once I was home, I took a shower and scrubbed my leg really well, since I felt so gross after that. Lucky for me, I never saw him again. But for a while after that, I made sure to cover my tattoos every time I went outside, just in case. When I was 21, I worked as an assistant teacher.
I had plans to visit friends in another state and intended to spend the summer there, so I subleased my apartment and stayed with my parents for a couple of weeks before I left. My parents lived in a rural area of Wisconsin, just south of Madison. I really loved to run and would jog in a park near my parents' house after work. This park was basically a mile loop that was uphill the first 1/3 of the trail, and then level for another third, and then downhill for the final third. It was heavily wooded, and the upper portion was bordered by a rock quarry. In retrospect, it was stupid to jog there alone. There was a small gravel parking area at the entrance of the trail. I hit the trail after work one day, and on my way uphill, I started getting a sense of panic. I turned around and actually started to run back down the way I'd come, but I then decided just to complete one loop. I told myself that it was just really hot, and I wasn't wanting to exercise in the muggy heat of late spring. Even still, I couldn't shake the intense feeling that something was wrong. As I was coming to the end of the loop, I could see the parking area. There was a cargo van parked next to my car. I could see someone clearly in the van, but as I became visible through the trees, they were no longer in the front seat. My car was not locked because there was never anyone at this remote park on a weekday afternoon. There was ample space in the parking area, which made it extra strange that this cargo van was parked right next to me. I decided that I wasn't going to risk it, so I ran across the highway and asked a man who was outside on his riding mower to walk me to my car. I explained to him my concern that there was someone possibly hiding in the van, and he agreed to walk me to my car and made sure I got out of there safely. I don't know what would have happened if I had not talked myself into completing that one loop. I think my intuition was causing me to freak out, and not the heat. That was my last solo jog ever in an area that wasn't heavily populated. I was 22 and living on my own for the first time when this happened during the mid-90s. I had just gotten off work around 11 p.m. To reach my apartment building, I could either walk on the sidewalk, which was lit with street lamps and decently trafficked, or cut across the communal garden, which was pitch black, set back from the street. I saved about 1 whole minute of walking time by cutting through the communal garden. That night, I got a weird feeling not to take the shortcut. I kept to the sidewalk, but there was no one else around. When I got past the garden, all of a sudden, this large man pops up from its exit path. There was no way he could have been in front of me, or just behind me as I was walking. I would have noticed him. The only logical explanation was that he was hiding in the pitch black garden. Was he a drunk who'd been sleeping it off? All that mattered is that my body was screaming at me to get out of there. I began walking faster. My dad had always taught me to carry my keys in my fist with a key pointed out in case I needed to punch someone. So I had that. But I'm 5'4" and probably weighed about 110 pounds. This guy was tall and big. My only chance was to outpace him. I'm speed walking at this point, and I feel him matching my pace, getting closer. He's breathing heavily. I feel this angry energy coming off of him. But my apartment building is right there. So I put on a burst of speed. When I reach the entrance, 2 people are leaving and hold open the door for me. And for him. I don't know why I didn't just tell them I thought this guy was following me. My mind froze, and I was just trying to get inside my apartment. Plus, I was still trying to rationalize it. Maybe he was visiting someone in the building? Maybe it was all just a coincidence, and I shouldn't be paranoid. Besides, it took only a couple seconds for them to be out the door. I'd missed my chance. I'm now climbing the stairs as fast as I can. It's a 3-story building, and I live on the 3rd floor. He's climbing the stairs too, and still right behind me. I get to my floor, which has 4 apartments on the right side, where I live, and 4 on the left. I passed by apartments 1 and 2. He's still right behind me. I stop at apartment 3, where I live, and he stops in front of apartment 4, where I know he doesn't live. He hasn't said anything. He's just breathing hard, and I think there's no way I'm going to open my apartment door and have him push me inside and assault me, or worse. He also hasn't knocked on the door of apartment 4 yet. It is worth noting that the apartments are U-shaped, with mine and my neighbor's door being very close together. So, I started banging on my own apartment door as loud as I can and yell my neighbor's name, screaming for him to let me in. This startles the guy, even more so when my own apartment door doesn't open, but the neighbor's does. My neighbor sees the guy standing right in front of his door and asks him what he wants. The guy started mumbling something about the wrong apartment, but I have my own door open so fast that I'm inside my place in a flash, locking the door behind me. I grabbed a cordless phone to call the police, but I hear my neighbor through the door telling this guy he needs to leave, and he eventually does. My neighbor knocks on my door and asks if I'm okay. I thanked him, said that I am, but inside, I'm still frozen, adrenaline pumping and scared. I thank him and tell him to have a good night and lock my door once again. I have my phone in hand, ready to call the police, but I start trying to rationalize it again. What exactly happened? A guy followed me home but then said he had the wrong apartment. Are the cops going to care about something minor like that? I was trying to calm myself down, but I'm also berating myself. Why didn't I run the instant I felt him following me? Why didn't I tell the people we passed when the front door opened and I thought I was being chased? Worse, why didn't I tell my neighbor the second he opened his door and saved me? He could have let me inside his apartment, and we could have called the cops together. But because of my own stupidity, everything felt so ambiguous, and I was questioning myself. A couple of weeks later, I'm visiting my grandparents, and my grandfather is reading the paper. He tells me that a woman was assaulted in the apartment building across the street from mine. It was by the same guy. He had multiple convictions for sexual assault, and had recently been released on parole. I'm a 33-year-old male, and I live in the rural Midwest. I was born and raised in my hometown, and with the exception of a few months of living with my father on the East Coast, I've lived here my entire life. I've become pretty acquainted with the majority of the back roads in my area. One such road is an old highway that no longer has the traffic of days prior to the construction of the interstate that runs through the town. It's a long and winding road that offers gorgeous scenic views during the day and a quiet escape from the city at night. Along this road is a small lot with no more than 10 parking spaces, 2 picnic tables, and a single trash can. It is easy to miss due to the heavily wooded area surrounding it, and the majority of the rest because of the drive to it. Due to its secluded nature, it hosted a fair share of teenage debauchery. I myself spent many Friday nights smoking away with my friends. Needless to say, there was a lot of good memories attached to this place, and over the years, it became one of my favorite spots to venture to when I needed peace or solidarity. One night, it was about 5 years ago, my girlfriend and I were going through a rough patch. We had a big fight due to myself needing to work early in the morning, and her deciding to have a party full of her loud, intoxicated friends. Things escalated, and I stormed out of the house and started driving towards my favorite spot. As soon as I was out of the city limits, I promptly cranked my angriest metal music and sped down the road, chain smoking my menthols in an effort to calm down until I finally found the turnoff for the spot. I was happy to find no other cars in the lot, meaning I wouldn't awkwardly stumble upon two lovers engaged in the act. I immediately jumped out of the car and sat down on one of the picnic tables, lit a cigarette, and stared at the stars. I sat there for several minutes, until I decided to head back to the warmth of my car after hearing some rustling coming from the woods. I didn't want to become a chew toy for a coyote or an angry bobcat. I hustled back into my car, blared my music again, and quickly forgot the sounds I just heard. I decided to have one more smoke and then make my way home. I smoked it way through, when out of nowhere, I heard pounding coming from the passenger side of my car. I looked over to see a large hand beating against the window. I turned down my music that was still blasting, and as I did, I heard a very angry voice shouting. He was yelling for me to open the door, and now punching my window trying to get in. I was frozen in a mix of confusion and fear, but eventually snapped out of it and threw my car in reverse. It was so dark I didn't get a good look at the guy, except for a split second where he was illuminated by my headlights. He had a black zip-up hoodie with the hood pulled over, a dark gray shirt, and a ball cap. He was a stocky guy, and had to be well over 6 feet as he towered over my Sonata. The only distinguishing feature I could make out was a very dark, large beard. I noped out of there real quick. I floored it across the parking lot and back towards the highway. And that's when I heard it. A loud bang that sounded like a gunshot. I slammed my foot on the pedal and took the first turn I could find. Once I was sure no one was following me, I slowed down and realized I was doing 90 on a gravel road. At the time, one of my best friends worked for a nearby gas station, so I made my way over to tell him the whole story. We looked over my car thoroughly and found a couple of dents on the top of the car and what looked like a boot print on the passenger door. We talked it over and ultimately decided not to call the police. It's a 20-minute drive to the location from the closest town. We were sure that the guy would most likely be gone by the time anyone actually got there. And yes, I realized this was ignorant of me in hindsight. I'm still baffled by this encounter. I don't know if the guy wanted to rob me, steal my car, or worse. But I'm glad I made it home in one piece. I hope I never have to meet that maniac again. I'm a female in my mid-20s. I went to the local grocery store tonight around 5 p.m. Since it's winter, it is dark by 5 p.m. where I live. I was in an aisle taking my time deciding between the options. That was when this late 20s, early 30s looking guy with light features, glasses, and a scruffy beard comes up right next to me and just stands there. I didn't think much of it or even look at him at first because I figured, whatever, he's just looking too. But then after a few seconds, I noticed he wasn't moving or doing anything, just standing there. I looked at him, and he was already staring at me. And for half a second, I thought he might say something. So I stood there for a second, just looking back at him. He didn't say anything, so I just turned and quickly walked away. At this point, I'm thinking, okay, that was weird, but whatever. Probably just an awkward guy who doesn't know how to talk to women. Then, not even 30 seconds later, I'm in another aisle, and I see him out of the corner of my eye coming down the aisle I'm in. Again, staring right at me. So again, I walked away as fast as I could, and just went right to the self-checkout. While I was at the self-checkout, I'm looking over my shoulders the whole time, making sure he isn't right behind me anymore. And he's not. I start walking out of the store, relieved that once again, I was just being paranoid and I wasn't ever in any real danger. As I'm walking out, though, I decide to look behind me one more time, and there he is, right behind me. I notice he has nothing in his hands, no groceries, and he's heading right towards the door right on my heels. Without even thinking, I stop dead in my tracks. I look right at him, and he's already looking at me. Then he puts his head down, looking at his phone, and walks past me out the door. He bought nothing. I'm so scared at this point, and my head is spinning. I didn't know what to do. I can see my car because I parked close to the exit. So I call my fiancé and sprint as fast as I can to my car. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started looking for this guy. Then I see him. He's aimlessly walking around the parking lot through the cars. He's pretty far away from me at this point, and I have my fiancé on the phone, so I'm feeling somewhat safe again. I watched him walk around for another few seconds before I got out of there. I have no idea what this guy was doing or what his motive could have been. Maybe he was just a weird dude who doesn't know how to talk to girls. Or maybe he was a predator with dangerous intentions. Or maybe he thought I looked like easy prey for a robbery. The thing I really can't wrap my head around is the fact that each time I noticed him, he was already staring at me. He was not discreet at all, and I would think a dangerous predator might be a little more inconspicuous. He also didn't buy anything from the grocery store, which I also can't understand. I was in the store about 5 minutes before I noticed him, so I'm sure he didn't follow me in. Am I just being paranoid? There's a lot that didn't feel right, so I'm having a really hard time rationalizing this experience. It was definitely a creepy encounter, though. I'm an 18-year-old female, and I live with my parents on their farm. We have a relatively big house, with a nice back patio. We got a hot tub a while back, which my parents use a lot, and I sometimes join them. Since I have my own car, my parents have gotten more comfortable with leaving me at the house when they leave for extended periods of time. The longest they've been gone is almost a week, and they keep in contact with me the entire time. I just take care of our animals and chill out if I'm not working, and I've gotten used to being alone. My parents were both raised in farming, ranching families, but I was a city kid until they bought a farm and moved us out here. I am used to it now, but it took quite a bit of acclimating considering I'd lived in our previous house for 13 years and knew the city like the back of my hand. You could have placed me anywhere, and I'd be able to find my way back home one way or another. Anyway, this took place a few weeks ago, and my parents had gone to a distant cousin's wedding, leaving me at the house to overlook the farm. I was fine with this, as I didn't really know the said cousin very well, but sent my well wishes with my parents. We sent constant updates back and forth the few days they were gone. I believe it was the second or third night. I'd gotten home from work absolutely exhausted. I decided to relax in the hot tub for a bit to soothe my sore muscles before going to bed. I'm a bit of a night owl, so by the time I'd taken a nap and had dinner, it was around 11 p.m., and the sun had pretty much set. Another one of my favorite things about living on a farm is the lack of light pollution. I can look up and easily see the stars above me. I've always been into astrology and astronomy, and I love stargazing. That was part of the reason I waited so long before going out to the hot tub. I went out and got myself settled. I sat in the water, enjoying the stars, heat, and occasionally sipping my drink I'd brought out with me. It was still light enough that I could see the edge of our property, but dark enough that I could see the stars relatively well. I was probably out there for about 10 minutes or so. That was when I got a sudden chill down my spine, and it wasn't from the breeze on my heated skin. It felt like I was being watched. Immediately, I snapped out of my daze and turned to where I felt like it was coming from. It took my eyes a bit to adjust, as I'm nearsighted and didn't wear my glasses outside. And that's when they did. I felt my stomach drop at what I saw. From the patio, looking straight ahead, you could see our barn, which has some fences connected to make a couple of pens. Our older horses are in the largest pen to the right of the barn,
and behind the pen is a large field that stretches to a row of saplings. Behind the saplings is a barbed wire fence, which indicates the edge of our property. To the left of the barn is a patch of trees that led into the forest that surrounds the property. Though there is a few divots here and there, where we've set up some other farm things like a garden and chicken coop. While I couldn't see directly behind the barn, I could see beyond it, into the field behind the pens, which is where I spotted what I figured caused my feelings of unease. A few feet of the forest, standing between two of the saplings at the edge of our field, was a figure of what I assumed was a person, just standing there in the darkness. I immediately knew that that's where the feeling was coming from. I stood up in the hot tub and turned to face the person. For a few moments, I just stood there, looking at them. I didn't know if they saw me, but when they didn't move after staring at me for a solid minute, I decided enough was enough and got out of the hot tub. I closed up everything as quickly as I could, while trying not to look panicked, and went inside. This is where I immediately turned on all the lights, shut all the windows, and locked all of the doors. My dogs had been inside the whole time, none the wiser to the trespasser. I figured it'd be best if I didn't alert them as to what was going on, in case it turned out to be nothing, even though I was pretty sure I was right about what I'd seen. I debated on calling the police, but I lived 20 minutes from the nearest town, so by the time they got there, the person would likely be gone. Besides, it was already midnight, and I didn't want to wake up my neighbors with the commotion the authorities may bring. I resolved to sit in the living room with my dogs and keep an eye on the person from the inside. Our living room has windows that face outside in the same direction our back door to the patio does, so I could see the same view from the hot tub, albeit a little more difficult with the lights on. But ever since I've seen the figure, it was impossible not to notice them afterward. The thought crossed my mind to grab my stepdad's rifle from the basement, but I have no idea where he stored it or even how to use it. The more time passed, the more antsy I became. The person was just standing there, not doing anything, in the same position I'd spotted them in, and their apparent lack of motive was unnerving to me like nothing else. I resolved that, if they didn't leave within the next half an hour, I'd call the police, because at this point, the person would have to be standing there for about an hour, trespassing on our property. More time passed. I stayed in the living room with my phone in hand and dogs at my feet, looking out the window every few minutes to see if the figure was still there, which they were. By now, it was 12:15 in the morning, and they still hadn't moved. It was 12:20 when things finally changed. As I was looking out of the window for probably the 50th time that night, I saw the figure move. I froze, not moving a muscle, as I watched them turn and walk back the way I assumed they'd come, to the left where they disappeared behind the barn. My relief was only temporary, because while they were gone, they could still very well be on our property, just hiding out in the trees. Finally, the feeling of being watched was gone, and it made me feel a little bit better, but not by much. I decided to pull an all-nighter, and stayed up until the sun rose, and I decided to pass out on the couch. I woke up around 1 p.m., and had a moment where I thought I dreamt the whole thing. Just in case, after I finished my chores, I made my way across the field behind the animal's pen to our property line, and walked from one end to the other to see where the figure would have disappeared to behind the barn. I also wanted to see if I could find anything out of the ordinary. It had been dry for the past week, so the grass and dirt didn't show any footprints or sign of anyone being there at all. This made me suspect that maybe I imagined the whole thing. I have a history of being paranoid because of my anxiety, and have had multiple nervous breakdowns over things that turned out to be inconsequential. Still, I couldn't just forget about the feeling I'd gotten in the hot tub that night. The unmistakable feeling of having someone's eyes on me, not being able to tell who. To this day, I still have no idea what it could have been. To be honest, I don't really want to know. 3 years ago, I bought my first apartment in a working class area. The apartment overlooked a busy arterial road, which is the main connection for people headed to or from the highway, so it sees a lot of traffic. For the most part, living there was fine, but this one incident ruined living in that area for me. I work in the city, and parking is expensive, so normally I get the bus for my commute. It was actually pretty convenient, because the bus stop was outside my apartment, so it was almost door to door. I got off the bus after work one evening, and there was a man standing there. He approached me and said his car had broken down because he'd run out of gas. He pointed south down the road to his car, but there was no broken down car I could see. He was holding a gas can. He wanted me to walk about 5 minutes down the road to a gas station. I was creeped out by this guy, and I couldn't see his car that he kept talking about, so I said no. At first he said that's fine, and he started to walk away. But then he turned back and tried to punch me. I then ran out across the busy street to get away from him while he screamed something. He said he would be remembering my blue-colored eyes, and if he saw me, he'd kill me. I kept running across the road, dodging cars. I didn't want him to know that I lived at the apartments, so I took the long route around the entrance on a different street. About an hour later, the same man was caught on CCTV trying to break into each apartment building in our complex. He was also caught trying to do the same thing at an apartment complex down the road too. That put me off getting the bus at night for a while. I'm a teenager who helps out his dad on the allotment. If you don't know, an allotment is like a mini farm. You can plant veggies, have animals like chickens or rabbits to care for, and other things. This happened recently, and this still creeps me out. In the evening, my dad says we need to go to the allotment to feed our chickens, as he forgot to feed them earlier that day. It was around 8 p.m. when I agreed, and we went to the car to start driving. When we got to our allotment, which is like a 15-minute drive, it was already dark outside. Not a lot, but dark. I opened the gates, let my dad drive in, and then closed them. As I was about to think, I saw a black car outside. The car belonged to a guy that used to be chill with my dad, but they both kind of fell off from talking to each other. My dad said he was becoming more mentally ill, as the guy had had a divorce and got his kids taken by the mother. The guy lives on the allotment now, even sleeps there. There's also other people who have a spot in this allotment as well, but as of now, there's only me, my dad, and the guy here. After my dad parked the car, we got out and started getting the food for the chickens out of the trunk. While my dad was doing that, I looked at his ex-friend's allotment, only to see him staring at us. It was dark, so I could only see a shadow of him, but I knew he was staring at us. I also had a gut feeling, but I decided to ignore it. We went and fed the chickens, and were about to go home until my dad almost forgot something. He went to the shed at the end of the allotment to go grab something, and I was going to enter, but had a feeling I needed to wait out instead. As I asked my dad how much longer until he finds what he needed, I turned back to face our gate being opened. I didn't see it at first, but saw the guy trying to enter quietly. He stared at me and slowly closed the gate before just disappearing. I didn't react or say anything. I just stood there. I thought of telling my dad, but didn't want to scare him or something. In the end, this isn't a horror movie where I should scream like a girl. My dad left the shed, and now we can go. As we were leaving, we heard a sound like an axe hitting wood non-stop. We knew something was wrong, so we quickly walked to our car, started it, and went to the gate. I left the car creeped out because of that guy going around the allotment. I quickly opened the gate and let my dad drive through. As I was closing the gate, I saw something that terrified me on the spot. The guy was just standing there, 20 meters away from me, staring. I I couldn't see any details but just the darkness on him. He was holding something in his hand, but then he just moved and went into some bushes. My dad got out of the car to lock the gate. He looked at the bushes through the closed gate and then rushed into the car. When we left and started driving, I asked my dad if he saw what I saw, and he saw someone hiding in the bushes, squatting and looking at us. My dad said he saw him holding something too. It looked like an axe or a knife. We left terrified, but tried to laugh it off, knowing we were probably close to being attacked, or worse, dead. We went back to the allotment at the same time around 8 p.m. a few days after what happened. We saw the guy's car in the allotment, and we knew we needed to be quick with feeding the chickens. As we did, everything was going fine until as we were about to leave, my dad stopped me and we hid over a blue shed. My dad said, "He's there. He's in the bushes." My heart dropped. I told my dad where he was, and he said 5-second walk and we're done. We quickly ran to the car, closed it, and drove off. For a second I saw him. He did have an axe. I'm not sure if this was a haunting or a possible case of frogging, but we'll never know. When I was in my early 20s, I ended up dog sitting for a week at my uncle's place completely by myself. It was January, and it was freezing outside. The house was built by my grandfather for his sister, who passed away when I was about 6 years old. She died young from cancer. My only memories of her are from those last days when she was in hospice care, right in the living room. Everyone in the family loved her, and I wish I could have known her better. A few years after she passed, my uncle and his partner bought the house and completely renovated it. It's actually pretty nice, especially considering it was built in the early 70s. After my uncle handed me the keys and showed me how to use the security system, I settled in. I was excited to have the place to myself, especially since I usually had roommates and never got any alone time. But what started as a relaxing week quickly turned into something much more unsettling. On the second day of my stay, we got hit with an Arctic vortex, and everything was covered in thick ice and snow. So I was basically trapped inside. That second night, I couldn't fall asleep. I just laid there for hours, counting sheep. I started hearing voices that seemed to be coming from outside. I remember thinking, wow, you can really hear the neighbors in the subdivision. Then, about 20 minutes later, the home security system went off. That freaked me out, so I got up to check the alarm. The screen said, "Basement door ajar." I didn't know what else to do, so I grabbed a knife, not my brightest idea, got the dog, and headed downstairs. Now, the basement is unfinished, and there's a sliding glass door down there. My uncle always puts a bar in the track to keep it from opening, even if it's unlocked. When I go down there, the door was open, and the bar had been removed. The ground outside was covered in snow, but there were no footprints. I thought about calling the cops, but then I remembered the stash of weed I had found in the basement and decided against it. To make things worse, I had taken a sleeping pill about 10 minutes before all of this had happened, so my body was getting heavier and heavier as I searched the house. Eventually, I just collapsed from the exhaustion. When I told my friends and family about it later, most of them were skeptical. They said I probably left the door unlocked and maybe the dog opened it somehow. But that honestly made no sense. The dog was sleeping in my room, and no way a dog could remove a bar from the sliding door. What really got me later was realizing that the door couldn't be opened from the outside. That meant someone or something was trying to get out, and that made it even more creepy. And unfortunately, that's just the beginning of the weird stuff. The next night, I was lounging on the couch watching movies. That was when I heard a soft thumping against the side of the house. It sounded like someone was throwing a tennis ball at the wall. At first, I brushed it off as just the pipe settling in on an old house. But then it happened on the opposite side of the house. The thumping continued. The sound started moving around to different sides of the house, always in the same order and rhythm. It repeated this pattern 3 times before moving to another part of the house. This went on for about 2 hours, and I was getting really frustrated and annoyed by the constant knocking. Then, just as it suddenly started, it stopped. Over the next few days, I started noticing things being out of place. I'd set something down, and later it would be somewhere else. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful. I decided to get more organized. I started closing doors behind me to make sure that I wouldn't misplace things. I even laid out my work uniform and shoes on the kitchen table to make getting ready in the morning easier. When the ice and snow finally cleared up, I was able to go back to work. That morning, I got up early, took a shower, and everything seemed fine. None of my stuff was out of place, and I was about to head out the door. I saw my shirt and shoes at the table and thought, great, everything here is going smooth. But when I bent down to tie my shoes and reached for my shirt, it was gone. I had just seen it folded and ready to go the night before, and now it was missing. I started feeling crazy as I searched the house, getting more and more stressed out about being late for work. Eventually, I did find my shirt. It was in the spare bedroom, crumpled up in a ball and thrown into the corner of the room. I was so confused and frustrated as I made my way to work. Later that day, when I went back, I let the dog out through the basement sliding doors. As I sat inside avoiding the cold, I heard soft footsteps upstairs, moving from one side of the house to the other. I grabbed the dog and checked the whole place again, but of course, I found nothing. At this point, I started doubting my own sanity. I wondered if I was slipping into some kind of psychosis. The footsteps happened again the next day. On the last day of my stay, one of my friends came over to help me tidy up the house before my uncle returned. We were sitting downstairs while my dog was outside, both of us looking at our phones, when I heard the footsteps again. My friend didn't believe me at first when I told her about all the weird things happening, but this time, I decided to stay quiet and see if she heard it too. Suddenly, she looked up at me with wide, scared eyes. She asked in a whisper if I heard it. "There's someone up there," she said, pointing in the direction of the footsteps as they moved from one side of the house to the other. Then she jumps up and says she's leaving. I've never felt so vindicated in my life. After doubting me the entire time, she was suddenly terrified. When my uncle and his partner got back, I asked them if they have ever experienced anything strange in the house. My uncle's partner said that once he saw a woman in a white dress walking down their hallway. He always sometimes hears music playing from nowhere. What was strange was that my uncle's dog never acted weird during my stay. If he had, it would have freaked me out even more. I still struggle to make sense of what happened. Sometimes I wonder if someone was secretly hiding in the house, living in some unchecked corner. But then again, I don't think a person could have done some of the things I experienced. It is troubling to say the least. Have any of you ever felt conflicted after experiencing similar phenomena? Felt like an experience could be due to a person hiding rather than a haunting? Honestly, I almost want to believe it's just a person. But if it really was someone behind all of that, I'd be way more freaked out than if it was just a haunting. I used to live in a small village of about 140 people at the time, which now it's probably less. It was in northeast France. We lived on the east part of the small village, which is basically a street. About 100 meters from our house was my stepfather's parents' house, and right next to them was his grandparents' house. But they both died before my mom and I moved into the village. It was the beginning of the summer in 2013. The house of my great-grandparents of my stepfather were now occupied by a Croatian man who we'll call Mr. G. He was a very nice man who became very good friends with my family and still is to this day. He arrived in the house about a year ago at that point, and since it's summer, he left to go visit his family in Croatia. He asked us to watch the house while he was gone, which I did while I was 17 at the time. I would arrive around 8 a.m. in the morning and leave around 11 p.m. It was a nice house with 2 floors, and while I would spend about 90% of the time on the first floor, I would sometimes have to go upstairs to use the bathroom. There was a bathroom on the first floor, but it was full of spiders, and I'm afraid of those. One day, I was about to go back home, but before that, I had to go upstairs to go use the bathroom. The second floor always felt a bit off, especially at night. Like you weren't supposed to be there, or you were perturbing someone or something. As I went upstairs, I noticed the door to the bathroom on the right is open, which gave me a creepy vibe as it was pitch black. I decided not to pay much mind about it. I entered the other bathroom to do my business then. As I opened the door to leave, I see on the toilet across the hall was the face of a woman. Or more precisely, the head on a toilet, as if it was put on. It was looking at me and somewhat smiling. It also was not a maniacal smile. It was just a regular smile. That still scared the living hell out of me. I just ran out of there, leaving the lights on and my computer there. Here's a bit of backstory to go with it. Remember how I said that Mr. G arrived in this house about a year ago? Well, before he arrived, the house was bought by a family of 2 who ended up having a 3rd child while living there. They arrived in late 2009, early 2010, and they left abruptly in 2012. Well, the reason why they left is pretty sad. The father worked a night shift, and the one night, the mother had a terrible headache. Apparently, they didn't give any medicine for it, or at least it wasn't strong enough. She left her house looking for help, so she went to the neighbors, who were my stepfather's parents. Unfortunately, she would die on their doorstep. She died of a ruptured aneurysm. After that, the family left shortly after, which is understandable. Also, as I said before, my stepfather's grandparents died long ago. After my stepfather's grandfather had died, his wife committed suicide shortly after. She did so by jumping into the well that was located at the crossroads, about 20 meters or so down the street. To this day, I'm not sure if it was a ghost or my imagination. And if it was a ghost, it was most likely the mother, and not the grandmother of my stepfather, as the face looked young and in her 30s. When I was 12 years old, I was in my bed, and it was around 10:30 at night. I remember I wasn't very tired, but I was wide awake. On the left side of my bed was the door to my room, which was open, and I was just looking outside my bedroom door, doing nothing. I was staring and hoping that at some point I'd fall asleep, but again, I wasn't tired at all. My parents were in their room not far from me, and I could faintly hear the TV, and at the time, my mom had a crystal lamp that she turned on every night. So outside my room, and my room itself, wasn't completely pitch black. It was bright enough to look around my room, but dark enough that I could sleep. As I was laying on my side and looking out of my door, I thought I'd just turn over to the other side, and maybe the dim light was keeping me up. But as I turned to the other side, what I saw was as clear as day. It appeared to be a child with white pasty skin, the color of a cold dead body. It had short, straight black hair, and the mouth was open wide. The worst and most terrifying part that I will never forget was the eyes, or at least there were no eyes at all. Just pitch black holes, but I could feel whatever it was, even though I thought it didn't have eyes, staring straight at me. It was as real as when my mom was in the room saying goodnight to me earlier. I froze for 5 seconds, trying to process what I was seeing. I felt its presence when we locked eyes. It didn't make any noise or even move at all. Very soon, the confusion and shock turned into pure terror. I've never jumped out of bed faster that night. I ran directly to my parents' room, crying and shaking intensely out of fear. I'm now 26 years old, and I've never forgotten what I saw that night, as well as the feeling of its presence. Remembering it never fails to give me goosebumps and a sense of fear. I've never been able to explain it. I never watched horror movies or had anything to do with ghosts and the paranormal. So whatever I saw that night was 100% new to me.